Evo, lijep pozdrav svima. Mi polako krećemo sa našim novim online razgovorom i ovoga puta doista mi je veliko zadovoljstvo i veselje, baš sam evo sretna što ću imati i ponovno priliku vidjeti i razgovarati našeg autora, poznatog britanskog filozofa hrvatskih korijena i usudila bih se reći planetopijnog prijatelja Romana Krznarića. Evo, pozdrav ekipa, svi koji se pridružujete. Ja ću sada pozvati Romana da uđe u naš razgovor. Dok pokušavam izvesti ove sve tehničke stvari. Razgovor će biti na engleskom jeziku. Evo, nadam se da ćemo se uskoro pridružiti. Razgovor će biti na engleskom jeziku. Hello! I was just doing
Hi, how are you?
invitation.
How are you doing?
Really good. How are you? It's been a long time. I think 5 years, not for sure 5 years since we last talked.
It has been a little while, and unfortunately, I haven't learned to speak Croatian in those 5 years. So my apologies.
And there goes my first question. What have you learned in those 5 years? Although you do have Croatian roots. So just briefly, I was doing the introduction and I introduced you basically as our friend. I hope I didn't do a mistake. So a lot has changed, to say the least, globally. And often I ask our guests and authors, is there a lesson or lessons that you personally learned during this pandemic?
So is there a lesson? Well, in a way, I think some of the most fundamental lessons actually have to do with the book I can see in the background, which I also have here, which is about empathy. I mean, I don't know what it's been like, what it's like in Zagreb and Croatia, but in my street in Oxford in England, you know, even just a few days after the pandemic began and our lockdowns began, you know, we were a street where people didn't really talk to each other very much. But within a few days, we'd formed a WhatsApp group. There were 100 people helping, you know, vulnerable older people, delivering them food, sharing food recipes, you know, all sorts of things. And there was this real sort of explosion of community and trust and empathy, really. And I think it's one of those things that shows when humans are in a crisis, you know, it sometimes brings out the best in us, you know, not always, but I think that's been very striking. And the fact that, you know, these kinds of communities, like little WhatsApp groups, emerged all around the world in rich countries, poor countries, and certainly in England, there seemed to be more action coming from communities than from governments. You know, we were, as a community, we were ahead of the government in terms of taking action. And I think that really, you know, had to do with the crisis and this sort of outpouring of empathy. So that's, I think, that gives me hope on some fundamental level. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I think that it was an opportunity for a personal lesson, something to become more aware of what is important, where are our values, what do we want to do, how we want to look at the situation, will we build our optimism or be realistic or even be pessimistic. But I think there is a difference now, because first we thought it will be a sprint, now we see it's a marathon actually. So like in this second wave, I think things are becoming a little bit, maybe even more challenging to endure it mentally or emotionally. And what do you think?
Well, actually, that really brings up an interesting topic, which is the nature of time. You know, that in many ways, you know, talking about, is it a sprint or is it a marathon? I mean, I think COVID-19 has really changed, I think, a lot of people's perception of time, or has done something weird to it. You know, when you're, at least me, stuck at home with my kids for months on end, and you lose that sort of sense of time. And, you know, that's really interesting. It's actually, sorry, I don't mean to keep drawing my books, but I did bring out my Croatian books. Now, in this book, The Wonder Box in English, you know, there's a chapter, there we are.
And I have to say, I'm sorry for interrupting you. I think it's this is my personal copy, and it's underlined on every page. You can see. I mean, I won't show you, so you don't see what I've written actually, but it's highly recommended. So yes, okay, please go on.
Thank you very much. I approve of underlining books. I think it's a good habit. But I think certainly the last year, I think a lot of the way they think about time has changed radically, partly, when people are being stuck at home, bored, or, they've been laid off from their job or something like that. They've got these expanses of time. And, in some ways, I think a lot of people respond like I have responded, by trying to put it all out of my mind by just binge watching television, turning on Netflix and being in a way immersed in a slightly meaningless moment. But I think something else happens, to some people, which is they start thinking about a bigger picture. It's that timelessness is a time to reassess life. What am I doing? Where am I going? And I think that's happening in whole societies as well. Like, I don't know, cities like Amsterdam have taken had a radical response to COVID-19 and decided, right, we're going to go very green. We're going to have no fossil fuel cars after 2030. We're going to have a circular economy and all these things. But I think even as individuals, like me just in my own life, my wife and I decided, right, this is now the moment we're going to get rid of our car. We're going to become more free of fossil fuels. And in a way, it's that COVID-19 time warp, that time bubble that we're in has given us a space to think, okay, come on, let's take our own lives to the next stage of trying to live true to our values, about really, which is, again, going back to the marathon, the real marathon actually is about thinking long term, about being able to extend our minds and our thoughts even beyond our own lifetimes. What impact are we going to have on future generations? And that's a topic I've explored in a new book of mine called The Good Ancestor. But I think I just think, time is something that has been changing for a lot of us.
Yeah. For those who don't know, you mentioned that you got rid of your car, but that was only a continuation of your previous values, because for those who don't know, you traveled to Zagreb by train. You didn't travel by plane. Yeah,
that's right. And that was 5 years ago. And I think I've taken one plane flight since then, which was to my stepmother's funeral in Australia, I think. Yeah, but it's really challenging, what they call the love miles, having to, put some of those things into practice, and my children are saying, why don't we go on holidays here or there like other people? But
like normal people.
Like normal people. Well, what's normal? It was normal in the 18th century in some parts of the world to own a slave. That was normal. And then what's normal? It changes, and that's quite exciting in a way, in some good ways. That yes, we don't have slavery in most of the world now, but there's other things which have become normal, like looking at your phone 110 times a day. That's now normal.
Yes, definitely. To go back to this book, is there maybe something from history that we could have learned about how to deal with epidemics that it would be good to know now?
That's a really good question, actually, because that book doesn't discuss that directly, though, of course, humans have been facing epidemics and pandemics, at least recorded ones, for 3,000 years, going back to the ancient Greeks and Romans and in China and all sorts of places. I mean, I think, in a way, one of the things I've been looking back to is in 19th century Britain. So in the first half of the 19th century, in London, in the River Thames, raw sewage was just being dumped in the Thames, just from people's toilets, just went straight in there, no processing, and tens of thousands of people were dying each year because of cholera and other diseases. And then in the year 1858, the smell from the River Thames was so bad in the summer because of the temperature that members of parliament started having to wear masks over their faces. And they passed this emergency legislation, these new laws, to finance the building of London's sewage system, the new sewers or the tunnels. And for 20 years, they spent building these sewage tunnels. And the guy who was the chief engineer, an engineer called Sir Joseph Bazalgette, he worked with 22,000 workers, but he made the pipes twice as big as they needed to be. And that's why those sewers, those pipes, are still being used today. So if you go to London and walk down the edge of the Thames, there are these places, there's this area called the Embankment, going hundreds of meters. That's where all the sewage pipes are. And it's a really wonderful example of responding to a medical disaster, which was these tens of thousands of people dying, and responding to it with a long-term outlook. And I think that's one of those things we could really learn from history about long-term planning, because we know that those countries that had long-term pandemic plans in place, like Taiwan, have dealt with COVID-19 much better than those countries that had no long-term plans, like, you know, the United States, the Trump administration. They abolished their pandemic unit in the White House in 2018. So, you know, I think it's a good question, actually, that history can teach us a lot, not just about how to think about love or think about death, but actually how to rethink our politics. Yes,
and politics and love and death and pandemics, they're all connected. I would say a lot to learn on in every of those areas. So do you think that we as a humanity, I know it's a generalization to say we as a humanity, what does it mean? Are we failing in long-term thinking and planning, or are we good at it, or are we learning? Or do we need really a crisis to start learning fast?
Yeah, I think our failures to think about the long term are very deep. You know, they go back to the way time has been speeding up for hundreds of years. You know, by 1700, most clocks had minute hands. By 1800, they had second hands. So life's been getting sped up and shorter and faster. And, you know, it's been a long time that politicians haven't been able to see beyond the next election, or businesses past the next quarterly report. There's sort of short-termism built in everywhere, in the clicking of the buy now button on our phones and stuff. But I'm actually really inspired by, you know, there is a whole world of what I think was time rebels out there. By that I mean people who are dedicated to long-term thinking and intergenerational justice. There's some really beautiful examples in the cultural world. So, for example, there's a Scottish artist called Katie Patterson, and she's got this 100-year art project called Future Library. And every year for 100 years, a famous writer is donating a book which will remain secret in this future library until the year 2114, when the 100 books will be printed on paper made from 1,000 trees, which have been planted in a forest outside Oslo. And the first person to donate a book was Margaret Atwood, Elif Shafak, the Turkish writer, and many others have donated books since. But just think, you know, Margaret Atwood is never going to meet any of the readers. It's not going to be, she's going to be long dead when it's published. And this is it's like a gift, isn't it, to the future? And that's really, I think, what we need more of. We need to think about, you know, what gifts do we want to leave to the generations to come? What legacies do we want to leave, not just to our families, but to our communities, to our countries, to the living world? And there's so many of these really interesting long-term projects going on. I'm also involved in this organization called the Long Now Foundation in California, which is all about long-term thinking. And they've got this project called the 10,000-year clock. And it's a slow time clock being built as we speak inside a mountain in the Texas desert. And inside it is this clock that is going to last for 10,000 years, stay accurate for 10,000 years. It's taking them decades to build it because the engineering is really complex, but you'll be able to visit.
What's the power behind that clock?
It's powered by changes in air temperature between night and day. And it's that differential is being used to power the clock and keep it accurate. I really want to visit it one day.
Will global,
Sorry?
if global, I said warming messes up with the temperature, will the clock still work? If the temperature
I hope so. I think that they're trying to plan for all of those things. So okay. I don't know exactly the scientific details of how they're doing it, but they've got all these huge number of engineers and astronomers and all these people who are dealing with all of that stuff. So, but you know, it's kind of like a secular altarpiece, it's almost like a piece of religious art, you know, that is almost something to worship, to make us think about our responsibilities for future people, you know, that we don't tend to think about, you know, very much. They're not in the room with me.
Why don't we think about that very much? What do you think are the reasons?
I think it's partly to do with the way our political institutions work, those short-term electoral cycles. It's partly to do with how the human brain works. You know, that we have what I think of as a marshmallow brain, which is a sort of a part of our brains, only part of it, which focuses on, you know, instant rewards, immediate gratification. I call it the marshmallow brain after the famous 1960s marshmallow psychology test, where kids had a marshmallow put in front of their on a desk in front of them. If they could resist eating it for 15 minutes, they were rewarded with a second marshmallow. And, you know, the majority of kids couldn't resist it and they ate the snack. Of course, there are no marshmallows served in that fantastic restaurant I remember going to 5 years ago, you know, run by your firm.
Yes.
Yeah, not healthy enough for marshmallow. But in any way, so I think we're partly driven by this ancient marshmallow brain, which we share with rats and other animals. That's what keeps us clicking by now. But that's not the only part of who we are. You know, we also have what I would think of as an acorn brain. And, you know, this book I've just written called Good Ancestor, which is not out in Croatia, but it's got a little acorn on the front from an oak tree, knowing that we do have a capacity to do things with very long time horizons, even, you know, planting a tree in a garden that you know will not grow to maturity until after you've died. You know, people do that all the time. I mean, that's how we built the Great Wall of China, or that's how we voyaged into space, because we've got this in us. So there's always this struggle, you know, kind of going on between the marshmallow and the acorn. So yeah, it's partly inside us, but it's partly short-termism comes from digital culture, from the history of the clock, from high-speed consumer capitalism, all that kind of stuff.
But we also need some skills to think long-term, and we need empathy to think long-term, and the ability to face some possibly unpleasant future scenarios in order to make the changes now. And sometimes I feel that we just don't want to look at it, the possible harshness of our future, or insecurity, or even the possible collapse in many ways. How do you think it's nice?
It's a really complex question. I remember when I was first doing research for this new book, The Good Ancestor, and I was experimenting with how to connect with these future generations, because you know, I think you might know I started this museum called the Empathy Museum, and it travels around the world. And one of the exhibits is called A Mile in My Shoes. It's been in Siberia, but it hasn't been in Croatia yet. We'll get there one day. It's been in many countries, but one of a mile in 2021. So one of the exhibit called A Mile in My Shoes is a gigantic shoe box, and you walk inside and someone can fit you with a pair of shoes belonging to a stranger. So it could be someone who's been in prison or a Syrian refugee, and then you could actually walk in their own shoes while listening to an audio narrative of them talking about their own life in their own words. And that's about empathy, you know, stepping into people's shoes in today's world. But how do we step into the shoes of people who may not be born for decades or centuries? And so when I was doing the research for the book, I went and spoke at this festival, a beautiful festival called Seed Festival in England. And what I got everyone to do, you know, there were a couple of hundred people there. I got them to close their eyes and imagine a child in their life, you know, so maybe a nephew or niece or, you know, their own child or grandchild. And then I got them to imagine that child 30 years in the future, like a meditation with their eyes closed. Then I got them to imagine that child on their 90th birthday party. And I asked people to imagine looking out the window at that 90th birthday party. What kind of world is it? Is it a world of utopia, or is it a world on fire? You know, and I got them to do some, you know, imaginative thinking around that. And anyway, after we'd finished it, some people came up to me afterwards and said they were really upset by that exercise. They found it too confronting because they had such a dark vision of the future they didn't want to see, as you said in your question, you know. They didn't want to look at it. And that was a really interesting thing to think about. And I learned something from it, actually, that now when I still do that kind of imaginative journey experiment in, you know, whether I'm online or face-to-face doing talks and workshops, but I let people know that it can be a bit confronting. But and people often cry doing it, but I still think it's worthwhile, because we can't just keep our heads in the sand. We need to feel some of those emotions, and it's difficult to do, but we have an amazing ability to do it. You know, most other creatures can't think ahead, don't think ahead like that, and we can. So we should use this capacity to kind of empathically connect as much as we can with that future, using our amazing imaginative capacities.
Yes, so we shouldn't keep our heads in the sand or our hearts closed, because when the head is out of the sand and the heart is open, it can be a little bit tough, but things start to change.
And look, I mean, and just think of that copy of that book, Empathy. It's got a big heart on the front, you know, and I think it is about a kind of an emotional openness, a kind of a willingness to feel those darker, raw emotions. And, you know, that's okay. You know, as we know that it's not enough just to feel positive feelings all the time. I mean, yes, that's good, and we can learn from those, but we also learn from the difficult things, you know, dealing with a death or dealing with, you know, depression, all these kinds of stuff. It's not that I want to wish these things on anybody, but if we look back over our own lives, we know that it's often when we've gone through something more difficult that we change who we are.
And history teaches us that it is a part of life. Loss is a part of life. Pain is a part of life. Tears are a part of life. Death is a part of life. So actually there's no way to avoid it, at least not completely. I mean, some lives are severely horrible due to different circumstances, but in general, it is a part of life.
Yeah, and a lot of this actually, long-term thinking is about death, really. It's about to recognize that we're not here forever, but we know from lots of decades of psychology research that once human beings reach midlife, something like that, most of us start thinking about what legacy we will leave, you know, and to keep the fire of our life burning, you know, beyond death. I mean, that's one of the, in a way, one of the great beauties of death, for all its tragedies, is that it makes us realize our short-term existence. No matter what religion you're from, or even if you believe in reincarnation or you have a heavenly paradise in mind, you know, most people still fear death and think about their legacies.
Yeah.
But we can express our legacies in many different ways. So a Russian oligarch might want to have a football stadium named after them. You know, that's kind of like Alexander the Great, you know, wanting to be remembered for your glories. You know, a lot of people want to pass on things and leave a legacy for their own families, like passing on a religion or languages or property. But I think if we're going to be good ancestors, to be really remembered well by all those billions of people, you know, yet to come, we need to think about leaving a legacy for something broader. And I think that's the point of that thought experiment. Like when I imagine my daughter when she's 90 in about the year 2100, I guess when I first started doing that thought experiment, what was striking to me was that I suddenly realized that she was not alone in the year 2100. She was surrounded by a web of family and friends and community, and also the web of the living world. You know, the air that she breathed, the food that she ate. You know, her body didn't end just with her skin. You know, her skeleton, it extended outside in the way that, you know, a tree is like our external lungs. I mean, the 2 trees in my garden create enough oxygen for 8 people. You know, and so all of these things, are, of course, are interdependent.
Well, talking about how long we are going to live, there comes to my mind this book, How to Seize the Day While We Are Living. So you have an interesting point of view that actually, if I understood you correctly, you kind of say that we misunderstood or misused this seize the day, carpe diem thing by thinking a little bit more selfishly. Can you explain a little bit about it?
That's right. So that phrase, carpe diem, or seize the day, goes back to the ancient Roman poet Horace, you know, so, and a poem of his. And, you know, it was in some sense about living life to the full. But there's a question of how do we seize the day? How do we live life to the full? And as that book explains in one of the chapters, in a way that, you know, that Nike slogan, just do it, has become just buy it. You know, that our way of seizing the day has been colonized by consumer culture. You know, that's how we try and live, by clicking that buy now button. It's been consumed by digital culture more broadly and consumer culture. And I think we've lost connection in a way with deeper ways of seizing the day. But again, I think, you know, there's many ways to think about this. So, you know, Steve Jobs famously, you know, always said he wanted to live every day as if it was his last. Okay, but that too, is that necessarily a good thing? Maybe then you would burn through all your money and take airplane flights everywhere and get revenge on everyone you've ever hated. You know, that's not the only way to seize the day. And then you've got, I remember talking about this with the
not recommended way to seize the day, definitely.
Not really, no. But yeah, in fact, I was talking about this the other day with a Japanese Buddhist monk, and Shokai Matsumoto, who's a really great writer, and he was talking about how in the 2 different types of Japanese Buddhist tradition, you know, to seize the day is to, of course, be living in the moment, to be here now. And interestingly, when we do that in a kind of a mindful way, it liberates us to think long term, you know, and to think beyond the now. And that's one of those sort of lovely things about a sort of a mindful attention on the present moment, that it can take us out of those short-term cycles and connect us with something larger. But what he was saying, which was really interesting, for a Japanese Buddhist monk, he said to me, I mean, this is roughly what he said, not exact words, but he said, you know, I've thought a lot about how Buddhism is about extending out circles of compassion and care across space, but not so much through time. You know, it's not so much through time, not so much about connecting with those future generations. So in the end, and I thought that was really interesting. But at least for him, the idea of to seize the moment is something that helps us transcend time.
So the opposite of what Steve Jobs said is what you wrote, not to live as if this is our last day here on this earth, but our first day. What does it mean? How to live? Yeah,
I mean, well, we have that idea of, I don't know if it in Croatian there's that exact same expression of live every day as if it were your last. Is there that expression? Yeah. Most cultures have some kind of expression like that. But I kind of stop and think, okay, is that necessarily a good idea? You know, why not live every day as if you've got 6 months left? Maybe that would give a very different perspective. Or live every day as if it was your first. You know, and I'm thinking there of the way children can be so, have a sense of wonder about the world. Maybe that's the attitude to cultivate. When you see snow for the first time, or you see the long neck of a giraffe, you know, if we had a bit more of that almost childlike sense of living each day as if it were our first, maybe we would live somewhat differently. But again, you can imagine having that philosophy, right? Live every day as if you're first, and it being one, if it has no ethical boundaries, well, then maybe you might feel free to exploit people for the first time as if it was the first time, or take those airplane flights everywhere and not thinking about carbon impact, all those kinds of things. So in a way, everything, you know, that book, you know, about carpe diem, about seizing the day, it only kind of makes sense next to my other books like empathy. It's like you need a kind of an ethical system. Yeah.
Here.
There you go. Thank you.
So what's the best, one of the best ways for you to seize the day?
Well, I think just in terms of a daily practice, you know, every morning I walk out into my garden and I try and find one thing that has changed. You know, a spider's web which has been spun, or a weed which has started to grow. Just one little thing. And, you know, I sort of feel that opens me to the day. You know, that gives me a kind of stillness. That's at the beginning of the day. But at the end of the day, one of the things I like asking myself is, what choices did I make today? And how do I feel about those choices? And to sort of go back, almost to be like a detective, like Sherlock Holmes or something, to look back over the day and think about was I really very conscious when I made some choice to, you know, do this piece of work or that piece of work, or you know, did I pick up the phone and really listen to my 87-year-old father properly? You know, or was I trying to do my emails at the same time? You know, what choices was I making, big and small? And I think that's one of the ways I think of seizing the day a habit, because seizing the day in the end is about the choices we make. It's about being an agent, you know, making decisions. But ultimately, I think one of the best ways I found in a more bigger philosophical sense is to do a little thought experiment, which I call the dinner party of the afterlife. And in the dinner party of the afterlife, you sort of imagine that you have died and you go to the afterlife, someplace, wherever it is, and there in the room at a dinner party are all the other yous who you could have been if you had made different choices. So there's the you who never bothered to make your marriage work and it fell apart. There's the you who always wanted to be a doctor and studied really hard to do it. There's the you who nearly died in a car accident and changed your life radically as a result. And you can look around at these alternative selves and ask yourself, is there another self, another me who I would rather be or become? And I do that quite often, that little thought experiment. And it's a little bit like Tolstoy's novel called The Death of Ivan Ilyich, where a man is dying on his deathbed and he looks back over his life and has regrets, really, for the decisions he made. So it's kind of like regret analysis, you know, but I think a healthy way of doing it.
Is it possible to go through life without regrets?
Oh, that's a good question. What do you think? I'll ask you first.
I wasn't prepared for you asking me questions. Well, okay. Often that question is asked in an interview to some famous person or a public person. And what I've noticed that the popular answer is no. I have no regrets. Everything I've done in my life has led me to this, and I've accepted that my every choice, and I'm not okay, like I approve of everything, but I'm accepting it, and this is good. So sometimes it just feels like a very popular PR answer to give. And I think people do have regrets, and yes, we would do some things differently. It's good if we have learned from the regrets or the things that we made maybe not the best way, dealt with not in the best way, but that means, I don't know, I don't think it's very possible, or we would really have to be in a like this really mindful, conscious way of really accepting everything, every part of ourselves and everything in our lives easily. So, and that's hard work, I think. So
yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think all those people who say I have no regrets, almost all of them are probably lying. You know, they're not telling the truth. That they, of course, they have regrets. But you know, of course, we like to justify the choices that we've made and feel that we haven't been idiots, you know, in the choices that we've made. And that's normal. That's how we live with ourselves. But I remember, you know, when I spent 7 years writing a PhD, you know, a doctoral thesis about an obscure aspect of Guatemalan politics. And after I finished doing that, I left being an academic. I mean, my career was set to be a political scientist. And I left it. And it was very confronting because I had to ask myself, and I've asked myself many times since, you know, do I regret those 7 years? And if I'm really honest with myself, I can easily say to myself, oh, I learned lots of skills that helped me become a philosopher and writer and all those things. And on one level, is that true? That is true. But on another level, I really wasted a lot of time. I spent a lot of time writing articles for academic journals so I could become a professor. And when I decided not to, yeah, I kind of regretted that. But I don't know, it's complicated, isn't it? But I still think it's a healthy thing to look back at the moments where we took our lives in different directions and try and learn about ourselves, you know, of course, and not just pretend that everything has led up to this moment and aren't I happy about how it's brought me to this moment. I've made all sorts of stupid decisions in my life, you know, things that I regret, the way I treated people, or you know, choices, career choices and things. But of course, on some fundamental level, they all add up to the story of who we are. You know, we are nobody except all those choices that we made, you know. And in a way, I think accepting the things that we regret is really healthy. And why should we only think about this when we are in the last years of life? You know, you probably know that there's a famous article, I can't remember what it's called. It's called something like top five regrets of the dying by an Australian nurse called Bronnie Ware. Yeah, mm-hmm. and you know, she asked all these people in a hospice, you know, older people who are dying mostly, you know, what do you regret? You know, they all say, well, I wish I hadn't worked so much. I wish I had done the stuff I really cared about. I wish I'd really spent more time with my family. All, I guess, the obvious stuff. But we don't have to wait till we're in the hospice, in the care home, before we think about those things. We can do it now.
And especially if we think about carpe diem as living every day as if it is our first, because if we think like that, then tomorrow we have a chance to make it better. If we think it's our last, maybe it will be.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. I never made that connection. Yeah, I never made that connection. But that's a really, really good reason, a good point to treat every day like a first day, in a way, because that, in a sense, it leaves us sort of more open, gives us more of a sense of agency. Yeah, that's a really lovely thought.
It's a little bit more optimistic, kind of. It gives the feeling of possibility. The last as well, but it will be very short, the possibility, and realization of that possibility will be very short. Is there something that you are really concerned about the future of our planet? Or is it, I mean, I know environmental issues are something that is close to your heart as well. So how do you feel about that, and what gives you hope?
I I mean, of course, I mean, over the years, I'm not naturally someone who cares about the planet in the sense of, you know, back in the 1990s, I was interested in human rights, and I wasn't really engaged in environmental movements or anything. But over the years, I've gradually become involved in various different ways. And that new book, The Good Ancestor, is all about particularly how do we think long-term about the ecological crisis. And ultimately, I guess what I've learned is that if we want to think really long-term and care about future generations, it's not just about lengthening our sense of time, but it's about reconnecting with place. It's about falling in love with mountains and rivers and lakes and savannas and ice sheets. Because it's the living world which ultimately sustains us. I mean, that's how every other creature on the planet, every other species has survived for the long term. It's by caring for the place, their ecosystem, you know. And that's what humans are very bad at doing as we push ourselves over the boundaries of carbon emissions and biodiversity loss and ocean acidification and soil degradation, all these planetary boundaries. So in a way, there's a hopeful message there, which is it's about falling in love, going back to your theme of love. It's about falling in love with the living world and finding your ways of doing that. And, you know, you can do it by planting a seed or going running through Plitvice or whatever way you plan to do it. There are different ways of connecting with the living world. And there's a beautiful, in Native American culture, there's a Mohawk blessing where they say, when a child is born, they say, "Thank you, Earth, you know the way." And I think in that is something very hopeful. It's about letting the Earth be our greatest guide, not just a book that I've written.
And it's almost a love verse, like expressing love and connection, and just realizing that not caring for the environment because we need it, but because we are a part of it. It's like we are consuming our environment through food every day, at least 3 times a day. So what are we consuming? What are we building into our cells, into our bodies, and so on? It's a web, and just recognizing that we are a part of the web, not a master of the universe would be good.
Yeah.
And definitely planting a seed, and what you're doing in a garden, I think it's really great for everyone who has a garden to notice what's one single thing that's different. But also reading good books like yours that give us a lot.
Well, actually, now you're speaking, I was just thinking that in my book, The Wonder Box, was it Cabinet Cuda? I'm not quite sure how you say it.
Close, Cabinet Cuda.
Cuda, sorry, it's got a...
Yeah.
You know, at the beginning of that book, in the chapter on love, I talk about how the ancient Greeks had 6 different kinds of love, like love of friendship and playful love and charitable love. But I remember a friend coming up to me afterwards who was an ecologist who said, you know, the Greeks were missing a 7th kind of love, which is biophilia, the love of the living world. And I think that's the one that we need to embrace and invent and connect with.
Our talk is unfortunately slowly coming to an end. But I would like to ask you, are you a YouTube fan? I'm asking you because of the cover of your Good Ancestor book.
Well, sorry, am I what, a YouTube fan?
Yeah. A fan.
In what sense?
Don't you have from the edge, like a recommendation for the book?
Oh, yes, I do. Yeah, a YouTube fan, yes. So I thought you said YouTube. As in, no, that's my fault.
No, that's
yeah, I got this quote from the lead guitarist from U2 on my cover of my book. I'm very pleased about that.
Yeah.
In fact, it's a complete accident that he gave me a quote for the book. It's not that I'm a great U2 fan, but in fact, it was another musician was reading the book, Brian Eno, who used to be the producer for U2 and David Bowie, and musician himself. And he was reading it and said, "Oh, can I let my friend The Edge from U2 read this book? He's really interested in future generations and creating a better world for 2100. I said, "Sure, do it." But since then, I've got to know him a bit, and you know, he's really committed. You know, U2 is a really interesting band because they've used their public platform for political purposes. You know, whether it's fighting apartheid or you know, poverty and hunger in developing countries. You know, so they're a really interesting group. So I'm now a big U2 fan.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for joining our conversation. It was really great to see you and send you greetings from everyone in Planetopia. Maybe
well, I hope to come back there. I hope to come back in 2021 or sometime soon. I remember my last trip there 5 years ago. It was really fantastic. So thanks so much for the conversation. I've really enjoyed it. See you soon.
Thank you. See you soon. Bye.
Ciao.